This is our first lecture that will discuss the colonial period and how it affected Mesoamerica. We will also discuss, in some subsequent lectures, we'll develop our history of the colonial period with later developments, as well as talking about specific aspects of the colonial period, such as literature, for example. We'll introduce in this lecture some of the major ways in which Mesoamerica changed during the colonial period. This is a several century period during which Old World powers, particularly Spain for our purposes here, attempted to dominate the native cultures of the New World. We'll talk about some of those major changes. We'll talk about the way the colonizers organized politics and religion and so forth in the New World. And we'll also talk about some ways in which the native peoples could express some agency and some resistance. So some of the topics will include religion, religious continuities, and religious changes during the colonial period. I do like to show this image in the lower left. This is an early 16th century ex-convent in the state of Oaxaca. This was a place where many Oaxacan Zapotecs were basically forcibly converted to Catholicism early in the 16th century, but it's also today a place where archaeological artifacts are stored by the Mexican government, and this is actually the building where I go to do lab work frequently in the summer. So this map is, I have this up here to demonstrate some of the territories of New Spain, some of the territories controlled by the Spanish during the colonial period. Now, this is a particular time. This is a snapshot of basically the holdings of New Spain, the New World territories that were controlled by the Spanish government in the year 1810. So this is before the expansion of the United States through manifest destiny, through conflict and purchases and so forth, westward toward the Pacific coast. But you can see here, at its height, just how much of the Americas was controlled by Spain. It's a really incredible expanse of the geography and the peoples of the New World. And for our purposes, our focus will be on Spain primarily because, as you'll see, or as you can see in this image, all of Mexico, Central America, and much of South America all were controlled by Spain. So the colonial period, as your textbook points out to you, it's a long time period of several centuries, so a lot happened, a lot of major shifts and transformations and so forth, changes in demography of the native peoples. But one of the ways to introduce this time of major change is through the economic shifts that it brought. Some of these were intentional, and some of the major ones were also, in a sense, kind of unintentional, or were unintentional consequences of intentional processes. So, for example, even today, if you walk into the grocery store, many of the domesticated plants that have become a major part of our diet have also become a major part of the diet of livestock, and in some cases are even used for fuel. All of these things, or many of these things, came from the New World. So New World domesticated plants became a major impact on Old World economies. And for this reason alone, I think this is really important. For this reason alone, we can't look at the colonial period as just the New World accepting the influence of the Old, right? It's not just the Americas being influenced by Europe. Rather, it's a much more complicated and nuanced interchange. It's kind of like a conversation. The New World being influenced in some fundamental ways, but also the Old World being influenced in some major ways. For example, maize or corn, tomatoes, squash, beans, avocados, sugars, potatoes, etc. All of these things came from the New World. Really major impact on the economies of globally. The biggest crop in the world today, in part because it's used to feed livestock all over the world, in part also because it's used in fuel. It's used in the production of high fructose corn syrup that's in a lot of our processed foods and so forth. Corn, the main domesticate of Mesoamerica, has also become the number one domesticated crop on Earth, right? Now, the old world, whereas it did accept a lot of domesticated plants from the old world had something that the new world didn't have, and that was a lot of domesticated animals, in particular beasts of burden, things that we think of as farm animals. So cattle, sheep, horses, and goats, and so forth. Animals that could pull carts, animals that could pull plows, animals that could carry heavy weights, heavy burdens. These animals came from Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and so forth. These animals came from the old world and were brought to the new. And in fact, the New World societies, the native societies of the Americas, did have some domesticated animals, things such as turkeys. In South America, you had llamas and alpacas that could carry some small burdens. But the major sort of domesticated animals that would change the economy of the New World came from the old. And so just the arrival of the horse, for example. There had been Pleistocene horses when the first peoples arrived to the New World 20 to 15,000 years ago. There were horses then, and people did hunt them. But those horses had been extinct for 12,000 years. So all the horses you see, even wild horses, quote unquote, running around in the American Southwest, those are really more like feral horses. Those are the descendants of domesticated horses originally brought by the Spanish. Along with those major economic, dietary, and domesticate-related changes were some demographic shifts that really affected the New World during the colonial period. As we discussed in our last couple of lectures, some of this began rather unintentionally. People did die during the conquest and early colonial period through conflict. There was war, there was conflict, but most people died, up to potentially 90% of the native population in the New World. Tens of millions of people, will never know how many. They died from disease primarily. And that made major demographic changes in the New World that really, for example, the country of Mexico didn't bounce back from for centuries. Today, now, demographically, Mexico and the other countries of Mesoamerica have largely bounced back from that, drastic, terrible effect of the early colonial diseases. But it took a long time. Perhaps because of this, because of the declining demography in the early part of the colonial period, the colonizers sought to organize native labor in a way sort of taking advantage of what native labor they could get, also bringing in labor from African descendant slaves who'd been kept in the Caribbean and so forth. They organized that labor through the hacienda system. So they were able to basically consolidate surviving indigenous populations into larger organized haciendas in order to take advantage of their labor. So while the introduction of old world domesticated animals such as horses and other livestock, cows and so forth, led to changes in the landscape, including erosion, in some cases even seeds that were present in the hooves of domesticated animals that had come over on ships brought new weed species and all kinds of invasive species. So while these natural sort of environmental changes were going on, the hacienda system and the consolidation of the surviving native population, as people are dying from diseases and so forth, also led to pretty major changes in migrant growth dynamics. So the village community that was such an ancient tradition in Mesoamerica was threatened by the consolidation of the native population into the haciendas. Now, as part of the hacienda system, in part because there were never that many actual Spaniards in most of these colonial areas, the descendants of pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican rulers basically continued to be treated in a different way. Essentially, the nobility of the post-classic period survived on into the into the early colonial period, and these were often, considered the owners of the haciendas or the organizers of the haciendas. So in a sense, the social inequality of late pre-contact Mesoamerica continued on into early colonial history with the survival of the nobles. So early in the colonial period, native identities remained largely tied to the local community, under some threat by kind of reorganization according to the hacienda system. And the concept of the altepetl, which is an Aztec word, a Nahuatl word, sort of continued to describe community organization in the early colonial period. So the altepetl is a really complex philosophical concept. Literally, it means kind of like cave mountain, and basically, it's a concept of a sacred combination of places. But it also came to mean a city-state. It came to represent local identity and so forth, and the continued political organization, the survival of the nobles. So the nobles were treated differently and retained kind of a higher social position. But it's worth keeping in mind that this isn't just a continuation of late post-classic Mesoamerican lifeways here. This is all set against the backdrop of forced religious conversion, where, for example, where I work in the highlands of Oaxaca when I do lab work at that early colonial convent I showed you, tens of thousands of Zapotec peoples were forcibly brought together and converted to Catholicism, often in Latin when they didn't even speak Spanish. They didn't necessarily even understand what was going on. In some places there was basically kind of a version of the Inquisition as any surviving native religious practices where they tried to stamp them out and so forth. Diseases were breaking out. You had sort of regional epidemics of smallpox and so forth that would basically continue the die-offs of native peoples and so forth. So it was a complex time, and a lot of terrible stuff was going on, even as native culture and Spanish culture began to sort of influence one another. One way to look at the colonial period is to think about how the Spanish, who were never that numerous in the New World, experimented with different ways to control this vast area that they had conquered, and a declining but still sizable native population. One of the ways they initially did this was through the encomienda system. And with this system, they essentially substituted themselves for the Mesoamerican native rulers who had been in power before their arrival. So they continued to require tribute. This is essentially the way the Aztecs had controlled much of Mexico. So the Spanish colonial rulers required tribute from native communities, even though the Spanish crown decreed that this was forbidden. So there was, even from the beginning, even from early in the colonial period, there was a tension between what the Spanish crown said was okay, made decrees, made law back in Spain, and what the colonial rulers were actually doing in Mexico. And if we think about tracing all the way back to the original arrival of Cortez to Tenochtitlan, he had gone there with a warrant out for his arrest against orders. So I'm not here trying to apologize for the Spanish interest in colonizing different parts of the world, but I am pointing out that there was a tension from early on in the colonial history that we will see will become expressed in the revolution when Mexico is going to seek independence from Spain. In a sense, the encomienda system had set it up so that the native peoples were a kind of legal slave who had to give labor to or tribute to the Creole leaders of the encomiendas or the encomenderos. These were often Spaniards who'd been born in the New World and were thus considered criollos, but of Spanish descent, who were seen as lower in the hierarchical system than peninsulares, the Spanish people who'd actually been born in Spain. So in order to sort of control for this power grab by the criollos, the Spanish rulers from Spain established a new system, the repartimiento system, which essentially changed the relationship of the native laborers with the colonial rulers. This was done not so much out of a human rights interest of protecting the native peoples, but rather the Spanish crown was concerned, and rightly so, it turned out, that the Creole Spanish descendants in the New World were seeking to establish wealth and power kind of apart from the Spanish crown. So in a sense, to control that sort of potential rebellion, the Spanish crown to create a new system, the repartimiento system, that in a sense replaced the encomienda system. Now, under this system, labor was meant to be used for public projects, so indigenous people still had to come together and provide labor rather than necessarily providing goods or materials as tribute to the colonial rulers. But the idea was that these would be for projects that were for public good. This was supposed to be public works projects, buildings that would be used by the community, for example, or communal farms and so forth. But often, this was still kind of hijacked through graft by the leaders of the colonial system in the New World, and the Creole Spaniards in the New World continued to amass wealth and power and so forth, especially in secluded parts of the new colonies. Workers were basically a captive audience. For example, the rulers of the repartimiento system, the Spaniards in the New World, had the opportunity to sell them goods that they couldn't get from elsewhere. This basically led to a system of debt peonage where the native peoples organized into these working camps basically owed money to the company store and were kept in a kind of legal slavery, a kind of legal servitude, as basically tenant farmers. Now, unfortunately, in much of Mesoamerica today, this tradition continues. There's a tradition where I work in Mexico, for example, of political leaders taking advantage of public projects in order to establish wealth and resources for themselves. So just for example, in the state of Oaxaca, there's a famous case where the governor of the state's brother basically hijacked the funding that was intended for a public highway project and used that to build himself a mansion. This is a bit like, I'm dating myself here, this is probably before your time, but this is a bit like in the early 2000s, a shady deal between George W. Bush and his brother and a textbook company in Florida, where essentially the government is able to establish private deals that end up benefiting the rulers of the government. So this is a major ongoing source of corruption in much of Latin America, and we can actually see it start early on in the colonial period. It's important for the purposes of this class that we don't just focus on the agency of the colonial rulers. This isn't just a case that, the colonial period, as I've mentioned several times, is not just a case of the outside world, European powers, in particular Spain, influencing the New World. Rather, it's an interchange, an interaction with agency on both sides. So one example where we can explore this is through the cofradia system. Now, these were religious groups that were actually legally sanctioned. The Spanish crown and the colonial rulers allowed these religious groups So in that sense, the European agency was involved here. But basically, the cofradías, which are these community organizations where basically a group of people will get together and on an annual or seasonal basis, their responsibilities will shift. And so one year, for example, one cofradia will be in charge of organizing the festival of a particular saint, perhaps the patron saint of a town. And then the next year, a different cofradia, or sort of like a religious club in the community, will be in charge of that festival. And so the responsibilities rotate. It's kind of an egalitarian practice. It helps as a leveling mechanism. It's an opportunity for social mobility, but it also served throughout the colonial period, and in a sense still today, as an opportunity for community action where the native peoples in these villages were able to get together. They were able to express social mobility. This was an opportunity for the women in these communities to help organize the way their towns were operating, even within the very patriarchal and repressive system of the Spanish colonial regime. So when the Spanish had arrived to Mexico, for example, in the state of Oaxaca, they found that indigenous societies such as the Mixtecs had a much more egalitarian concept of gender. Men and women, depending on the social class, men and women had many overlapping duties and similar rights, and women could hold political or at least sort of influential community roles. Women could own property and so forth. And under the Spanish system at this time, it was very patriarchal. And so the Spanish and the Mixtecs, just in this example, had a really hard time understanding each other's gender dynamics, and the Spanish attempted to enforce a very hierarchical kind of traditional patriarchal gender system. But it was in part through the cofradías that native women were able to sort of circumnavigate some of that system. Related to the gender dynamics and gender hierarchies that were kind of enforced by the Spanish crown were, organizations of the racial categories of people in the New World. New Spain was a super diverse place. There were actual Spaniards from Spain, known as peninsulares. There were Creole Spaniards who'd been born in the New World and so therefore were slightly lower on the social hierarchy, but nonetheless were European in their heritage. There were the native peoples. Increasingly throughout the colonial period, there were more and more mestizos, mixed native and Spanish ancestry. There were also African, slave descendants and African slaves, particularly early on in the colonial period. But still today, in parts of Oaxaca, for example, where I work, there are, especially along the coast in an area of Oaxaca and Guerrero known as the Costa Chica, there are descendants of African slaves who were brought from the Caribbean to work in Mexico, in part because the native community was dying off due to disease. And the Mexican government has in many ways ignored these African descendants in Mexico. In fact, it was only in the year 2015 that the Mexican census actually had Afro-Mexicano as a category that could be checked on the census. So there's a long history of overlooking these people and kind of a forced silence, at least from an official perspective, in particular on the Africans and African descendants in places like Mexico. Now, as these different communities were brought to Mexico and brought to the New World, and as they increasingly mixed with one another, the New Spain was a very diverse place with blending social and racial groups. And in response to this, rather than sort of moving away from a racial categorization, the official response on the part of the colonial organizers was to attempt to come up with a really complicated way of hierarchically ranking these groups. And due to measurements of how much mestizo one was, or how much native versus Spanish versus African blood one had, there were perhaps hundreds of categories ranked hierarchically according to skin color, according to how much of the different heritage one had, according to where one had been born, and so forth. Now, there were also some interesting exceptions where people of, for example, indigenous heritage could kind of rise up the ranks in this hierarchy if they became wealthy and powerful. So it was a system, a color-based and class-based hierarchical system for organizing the complexity of New Spain. But there was also a sense in which sort of money whitened, and if one had wealth and power, one's native or African ancestry could be kind of overlooked in a sense. So just as an example of the complex hierarchies established here, this is just one page out of a long text trying to categorize who people were according to their heritage and what name to give them. So if you look closely at these images, for example, you can see that it's more complicated than just a Spaniard, having offspring with a native, which you see in the upper left. What happens when a mestizo has offspring with someone from Spain? Or what happens when a mestizo has offspring with someone with African ancestry? So you can see here that you've got many different terms applied for the complex relationships that could arise through this admixture of populations. And so essentially you can see the colonial system kind of fighting against the tide here, where their answer should have been to just move away from racial categorizations because it was so complex. But instead, they, basically developed an ever more complex, numbered hierarchical system to try to understand the types of genetic admixture that could happen. And ultimately, it was a hierarchical system. And furthermore, these different categories of people recognized according to race, skin color, and also where they had been born, were sort of given stereotypical behaviors. So it was sort of assumed that peninsulares would act a certain way, whereas mestizos and mulattos would act a different way. As part of this, basically the native peoples were infantilized and feminized. They were sort of treated like children, or treated like, almost like a weaker category of human in a way. And partly this was done to justify the project of colonialism and to justify conversion to Catholicism as something that needed to be done for their own good. These native peoples were, not really adults. They're not really capable of making their own decisions. They need to be controlled by the colonial system. So I think you can see, in a sense, the colonizers kind of convincing themselves that what they're doing, even as millions of people are dying from disease and so forth, they're kind of convincing themselves that what they're doing is just, that what they're doing is, in the name of their church, and something that the native peoples and the African, slaves and so forth need from them. And part of this process was the conversion to Catholicism. The picture in the upper right there is an actual baptismal font at the ex-convent of Quilapan in Oaxaca, where I do some lab work. This is an actual big stone fountain where holy water was used to convert tens of thousands of Zapotecs to Catholicism. This is a forced conversion, in some cases with thousands of people lined up, where they basically faced the Inquisition that they had to convert or potentially be put to death as idolaters. There were trials to try to root out and stamp out any kind of remnants of pre-Hispanic practices. There are court cases where colonial rulers would try to identify what natives had been continuing to leave offerings at sacred places that had been sacred to pre-Hispanic Mesoamericans. And in a sense, this was kind of a softer version of the Inquisition that had been practiced in Spain, as the Spanish understood that the natives needed some time to assimilate. But also keep in mind, this conversion was often done in Latin, in some cases in Spanish, and especially early on, the native peoples who were being converted had no idea what was happening to them. They didn't understand essentially what they were agreeing to. As part of this, we can also see that some of the church leaders did eventually come to fight for native human rights. So, for example, Bartolomé de las Casas defended the native peoples against some of the abuses of the church and actually argued for the treatment of the native peoples of the Americas as humans with human rights in the halls of the colonial system, in front of the Spanish crown, sort of fighting for native rights. So I do want to emphasize that not all the church rulers in the colonial system had the same approach to how they treated the native peoples. One example of the syncretic practices that emerged in the colonial period is the famous Virgin of Guadalupe. The Virgin of Guadalupe is a very powerful religious symbol today, and the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe as an appearance of a saint speaking to a native person in the language Nahuatl at a sacred place in central Mexico is a really important story to give us a snapshot into the syncretic nature of religion emerging in the colonial period. I also want to point out that if this is something that's particularly interesting to you, I have posted a link to a documentary film in the weekly module. That's a film that you could use for extra credit. And I also want to say that the Virgin of Guadalupe and sort of exploring the different influences on this really important, sacred symbol in for Catholic belief in the New World today. That's a frequent topic of the final papers in this course, and there have been some really good papers that I've read from your predecessors in this course written about the topic of the Virgin of Guadalupe. So to get us all on the same page for understanding the importance of the Virgin of Guadalupe in the colonial period history, I do want to give a brief overview of sort of the story. So essentially, the Virgin of Guadalupe is kind of a vision of the Virgin Mary, but one who arrived in the New World, appeared in the New World as a native woman speaking Nahuatl and appearing 3 times to an indigenous peasant in central Mexico in the early to mid 16th century. So essentially, this vision of the Virgin Mary appears as a native woman to the indigenous man Juan Diego at Tepeyac Hill, near what is today Mexico City. She spoke Nahuatl and asked that Diego go to the bishop Juan de Zumárraga to request that a shrine be built on that particular spot. Now, the bishop didn't believe Juan Diego when he brought this story to him and demanded some kind of sign from the Virgin. She then appeared again, asking that Juan Diego gather flowers in his cape. When he did this, the flowers basically miraculously stained the cape, so goes the story, into the famed image of the Virgin. And when he returned to show these to the bishop, the image of the Virgin appeared on the mantle of Juan Diego. Now, according to tradition, it's actually the stained cloak of Juan Diego that appears at the Basilica de Guadalupe. It's not a painting, it's actually the miraculously stained cloak. The image of the Virgin itself is in an artistic style that seems to be emulating some wood cuttings from 16th century Spain. So there is kind of an art history element to this. It sort of fits within a tradition of imagery from the time period. And it's become one of the most visited religious pilgrimage sites in the entire world. In fact, so many people go to visit the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe that it had to be moved to a new basilica that could accommodate the massive crowds of people. Now, one of the interesting aspects of the Virgin of Guadalupe is that Tepeyac Hill, or Tepeyacac Hill, it's pronounced both ways, was also likely the location of a pre-Hispanic shrine to an Aztec mother goddess or earth goddess known as Tonantzin, who in fact is said to have kind of carried some of the same powers as the Virgin of Guadalupe, healing powers and so forth, the ability to cure injuries and so on. So according to the Spanish, when they arrived, this Tepeyac Hill was already a sacred place to the native peoples, and the Spanish had destroyed a temple to Tonantzin on that hill, but the memory of the area as a sacred place remained for the natives, and it was there that the Virgin of Guadalupe appeared to Juan Diego. So it's important to keep in mind that Tepeyac Hill, the sacred spot where the Virgin of Guadalupe is said to have appeared to Juan Diego 3 times and spoken to him in Nahuatl, was already a sacred place to the Aztec people and their related speakers of Nahuatl in central Mexico when the Spanish arrived. And so in a sense, we can look at the Virgin of Guadalupe as kind of continuing that tradition of a sacred place, continuing some of the powers and healing abilities and so forth of this Aztec earth goddess who had predated the arrival of the Spanish. Now, it's interesting to note that the canonization of the Virgin of Guadalupe, or the official acceptance of the image of the Virgin, of the story of the Virgin, and of the Virgin of Guadalupe as an official sort of sanctioned holy event, didn't happen for over 300 years after the image is said to have appeared to Juan Diego. So for some time, the church noted the rising popularity of the story of the Virgin of Guadalupe, but they were aware of the importance of the Tepeyac Hill to the native peoples that dated to before the arrival of the Spanish. And so they argued that this was pagan belief under a thin veneer of Catholicism. This was a continued belief in a native god. This was a polytheistic kind of practice that was under a thin veneer of Catholicism, and this was the indigenous kind of resisting their attempt to convert them to Catholicism. But nonetheless, despite the attempt to basically hold down or suppress this story, the popularity of Tepeyac Hill and the story of the Virgin continued to grow until the church was essentially forced to canonize, or forced to accept, the story as official church doctrine in 1895, after the independence of Mexico from Spain. So over 300 years after the original appearance of the Virgin, according to the story. Now, the Virgin of Guadalupe is a key symbol for Mexican national identity. You'll see it, on people's hats, on signs. It's hanging in people's cars. It's a major, icon for identity, for Catholic belief, particularly originating in Mexico. So this story, I think, has some key implications for our course, and one of them has to do with native agency. Faced with an imposed new religion from outside, a European religion that had been brought by the colonizers, the native people nonetheless were able to maintain a story of a sacred place, maintain some of the beliefs in that place and in the healing powers of that place, and in some sense maybe even the earth goddess Tonantzin, who had been said to occupy that place. And ultimately, through native agency, through 3 centuries or more of resistance on the part of Native people and a continued belief in the sacred place, the powerful Catholic Church was finally forced to accept this increasingly popular story or risk unrest in the New World. So this exemplifies the kinds of negotiations that took place during the colonization of the New World, where it wasn't just an influence from Europe into the Americas. Rather, it was kind of a conversation. And even though they were in a position of lesser power, the native peoples of the New World, nonetheless, through their collective action, had the ability and had the agency to resist, to modify the Catholic and colonial system in order to kind of find a place for themselves. And some of these sacred places in native Mesoamerica continue to be sacred today. I've seen, for example, places in Oaxaca that I will show you shortly that were sacred before the arrival of the Spanish and continue to be sacred today. If you have an opportunity to travel to Mexico City, you can visit Tepeyac Hill and the Basilica of Guadalupe, not far from downtown Mexico City. So you can see here on this map basically a driving or walking route from the Zocalo, the downtown of Mexico City, which was the square of the Aztec capital at Tenochtitlan, to Tepeyac Hill and to the Basilica in the northern part of the city there. Here you can see an image of the new basilica in the upper area, and the original basilica where the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe was stored for centuries. Essentially, this new construction was necessary both because seismic activities, earthquakes, and so forth that are so powerful in Mexico City because it's built on an ancient lake bed were actually causing the old basilica to sink, but also because it's not large enough to accommodate the huge crowds of people that gather to complete their pilgrimage to the image of the Virgin. And as I mentioned, the Virgin of Guadalupe can be seen in many contexts. Here you've got a sewing shop that's got the Virgin of Guadalupe as sort of their logo. I've seen hats, I've seen it hanging from cars, I've seen T-shirts. It's a major icon of identity for particularly Mexican Catholics. The story of Tepeyac Hill and the Aztec goddess Tonantzin perhaps influencing the modern Virgin of Guadalupe is just an example. There are other sacred places in Mesoamerica that were sacred before the arrival of the Spanish and continue to be sacred today, and to me demonstrate the continued agency and resistance, in a sense, to colonialism of the native peoples of Mesoamerica. One example from the state of Oaxaca, where I work, is up in the highlands of Oaxaca. There's a natural spot that's called Hierve al Agua, which is roughly translated kind of like the boiling water, or it boils the water. That is essentially a spring that's full of mineral-rich water that has deposited naturally these cascades of kind of frozen minerals. I'll show you a better example here. As you can see here in this image on the right, the effect of this mineral-rich water pouring over the cliffside in this beautiful highland area of Oaxaca is that it sort of looks like a frozen waterfall. And this is a natural process, but in fact, in ancient times, the Zapotec people in the highlands of Oaxaca set up terraces and built walls and so forth. And over centuries, those walls have accumulated deposits of these minerals that have sort of formed them into these natural-looking pools and terraces. And it sort of, in some places, kind of looks like a staircase pouring water down the side of the cliff face. And the artifacts from this site show that this is a place that was visited for probably thousands of years. It was a place that was an important, perhaps pilgrimage site to ancient Oaxacan people. And today, if you go to visit, it can be very difficult to get up there, particularly in the rainy season. But if you go to visit, you may still find people are leaving offerings of things like flower petals. The image on the lower left It looks a little bit like a crosshairs or a plus sign. What that probably is flower petals that have been used to show a symbol of a very ancient and widespread Native American sacred belief in the cardinal directions and in the particular influences of the directions, and in pre-Hispanic times the different rain gods that were seen as coming from those different directions. And this has been represented in flower petals, demonstrating that, you know, this spot continues to be a sacred spot, you know, before, during, and after Spanish arrival, despite Spanish arrival, and exemplifies, in my mind, you know, the continued agency of Native Mesoamerican people to express their belief in sacred places in the landscape.